Hey everyone, it's Wes again. My magnetic dampers on my C7 have been worn out since about fall. I wanted to get through winter with the old dampers, and now that it's warmer out, I'm going to be changing the magnetic dampers at about half the cost of what it would be at a GM dealer. So stay tuned.
These are the dampers I purchased. They are the direct OEM parts from rockauto.com. They were $320 a piece. The left and right side are the same, so you just need rears. This one's the rear and a front. This is the front, so I have two of each. And the rear part numbers and the front part numbers. And you can tell that these are the magnetic dampers by the fact that they have this sensor cord coming out the top of them. The other ones you will not see that. You have to be careful when you're ordering these that you get the right ones for your car. They do have different dampers for the Z06. I actually think it's just the rear of the Z06. Than the Stingray. So if you have a Stingray and a Z51, you need to make sure you get the correct ones. So this is the rear damper that I purchased from Rock Auto. They're the same left and right. In this particular orientation, I need the nut to be on towards the front of the car, so I actually had to rotate the lower part of the damper to get it in that orientation. It was good to go on the other side. So these are the tools that you need to do the rear damper replacement. I'll start with the sockets. You need a 21mm socket, an 18mm socket. This one's 1/2 inch drive, and I also have a 3/8 inch drive. 1/2 inch extension, and then I have a 3/8 inch extension that's very long. This is to get all the way in the wheel well with the torque wrench. I have a 1/2 inch impact. This is to get the bolts off. 1/2 inch torque wrench, and this needs to be at least rated up to 110 foot-pounds. I'll give the torques later, but at least make sure it can do 110. And then a 1/2 inch wrench. The last thing you need is a little dielectric grease, and this is for one of the connectors. So here in the wheel well, you can see that there's 2 bolts holding the damper to the frame of the car. Those are where the 18mm socket goes. And down here, you can see the bolt right over here for the 21mm socket. And I sprayed all 3 of those bolts with penetrating oil before I started in order to loosen them up a little bit. So I have my 18mm socket with the 1/2 inch extension, and I'm going to start working the top bolts off. Now I'm using the 21mm socket to get off the lower bolt. So now that we have both the bolts on top and the bolt at the bottom broken free, now we want to support the suspension so that those bolts don't have any force on them when we're removing them fully. So what we're going to do is use the floor jack to very carefully push on the ball joint on the bottom of the suspension in order to relieve the tension on the damper. So we'll just go here, and here's the ball joint. Very carefully raise your jack till it hits, and then you only need a little bit, about that much, just to relieve some of the tension, then we'll be able to back this one out the rest of the way. So using my 1/2 inch wrench and the 21 millimeter socket. I'm able to back this out the rest of the way, and then I can actually do it by hand because I've relieved the tension with the jack. And there the bolt comes out. Here you can see that the damper moves freely on this side, and that we'll be able to get the top two bolts. So now I'm going to use my 3/8 inch extension and my 18 millimeter socket to undo these the rest of the way. So I've loosened the upper bolts, but I haven't removed them yet because I need to remove the electrical connection to the damper first. So let me position this in here. So around the back, you can see this connector here is where your magnetic damper gets its electrical connection. There's a little Christmas tree that goes into the frame. Your new damper has a new Christmas tree, so you can actually just rip this out and then disconnect it from the wire harness on the car. There's a little tab, you depress it in the back and then pull it out. So all I have to do is you push on the back of this clip and it should pull out there. Let that hang, and then you just essentially rip this one out. There we go. And that connector's done. So now we're ready to remove the damper. What we're going to do first is we're actually going to lower the suspension slightly. So we're removing the floor jack, so that's free. Then we'll finish removing these two bolts. Now that the bolts are out and the suspension's lowered, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to lift the damper up a little bit to clear the bottom and then just slide it out to the side. So move this. We're going to go up. It clears on the bottom, and then you can just slide the damper right out. So this is my old damper. You can see here that there's some grease that has been coming out and collecting some dirt and debris. This side's actually not too bad. My other damper was completely coated. There was very little oil left. But if you see basically buildup on the outside of your damper, that's an indication that you have an oil leak. So this is the new damper again. So we're ready to install it. So what I'm actually going to do is remove the tape there. And you need to take the wire and place it behind where the bolts go, so that it'll be right along the frame rail. Then you go up underneath, here, go up underneath, take a little adjustment in here. There we go. Now I'm going to take my 18 millimeter bolts again and just start to thread them. Just get them started. So one thing you might struggle with is getting these bolts in straight. You obviously don't want to cross thread them because it's going into your frame. So pay special attention to this. The damper's not going to want to go in straight the first time. So after they're just kind of started, I'm actually going to lift the dampers slightly at the bottom and just back them out until I felt the first thread pop, and then I know that it's at the right spot, and then I can start to turn it in. And then after you get this one started, then you can do the same on the other bolt. So we're just getting these bolts kind of just good and tight right now. We'll torque them down in a minute. But after those are in, we're going to switch to the back where you have this connector coming in now, back here. And you have this Deutsch connector, which the O-ring on it is kind of dry. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to use that dielectric grease and put just a little bit on the inside of this connector so that when it goes in, it'll slide. On the other side, we had issues where it actually wouldn't go together because it was too dry. So a little bit of dielectric grease on the outside. I used a zip tie just to spread it around nice and evenly and be able to slide it in there. So I'm just going to take a little bit of dielectric grease, not much, about like that. I'm going to take the connector, just give it just a tiny bit, just so that it'll slide in. So there I have just a little bit of dielectric grease in there. Now when I go to plug in the connector, it should slide in nice and easy. And then it clips, just like that. So here you can see the two holes for your electrical connection. And the Christmas tree from the previous one is still stuck in the hole. So just take a small screwdriver and just kind of push it in. That'll end up in the frame, no big deal. Once that's in there, you can take your connector and just shove it back up into the frame. So putting in this Christmas tree can actually be kind of difficult. So if you get up underneath the car and you can stick your hand through the suspension here, and you can get both sets of hands on here and you're able to push straight up. That'll help. Also, there's another piece of harness here. On the other side, the Christmas tree was kind of damaged, so what I ended up doing is I just took a zip tie and just connected it to one of the trans cooler hoses to hold that in place as well. Ready? So you can see here that the bolt's not going to go in because it's not aligned. That's where you're going to use your jack again to push on the bottom of the suspension to align the hole. So very carefully again, lift the jack, center it in here, and then the damper will move side to side. So you just very slowly jack the suspension until the holes align, just about there, and then you should be able to very easily slide the bolt right back in. Next, we're going to torque these bolts into the frame. These are 74 foot-pounds. So I have my torque wrench set to that. Use my extension again. I'm going to torque. There. Now with the torque wrench set at 107 foot-pounds, we'll torque the 21 millimeter bolt. Now you have the new damper installed, you have the electrical connection to the top of the damper, and you have all three bolts torqued down. Now you can just lower the suspension with the jack. That's all that was. Reinstall the air scoop if you removed it, and put the wheel back on. So now we're going to do the fronts. Very similar to the rear. The only real big difference is that you'll need a few extra tools. So the same tools that you had before. In addition to that, you need a 13 millimeter deep socket and a 13 millimeter wrench. The other one you need is a 15 millimeter deep socket, and that'll actually be for the control arm, which we'll explain in a minute. So on the top here, it's the same as in the rear. They're 18 millimeter sockets to get that off. At the bottom, there's a little different style where it's a bolt that goes through with a nut on the bottom, and those are the 13 millimeter. One thing that we found is when we did the other side, we struggled to get the damper out because of how tight it is with the A-arm suspension. So I don't know if this is the right or wrong way, but what we had to do was we had to remove the 4 bolts that hold on the top control arm to give it enough play that we could slide the damper out. So this is a two-man job, not only for doing the 13 millimeter bolts below, but once you have the damper out, removing the A-arm and holding this so that it doesn't crash or have any problems while you're putting the new damper in. So there are 2 13 millimeter bolts and nuts that hold the lower part of the damper on, and you can access the nuts through these holes in the lower A-arm. So you would use your 13 millimeter deep socket with an extension, and you'll be able to reach right up there and grab it. And then you use your 13 millimeter wrench and go on the top, and you can start working it free. So we have the bottom 2 bolts removed, and we have these 2 loosened up here. Before we remove the A-arm bolts, we need to remove the electrical connection of the damper, which is actually in the engine bay. So you pop your engine bay, and you can see right here, it's coming out from the damper here, and it's the connector is down this way. So you have to unclip that gray connector. So you just reach in, probably block the view here, and push it forward. Now it's disconnected, and you should just be able to pull it apart. Push down a little bit on the gray connector and then pull it apart. There you go. Again, this has a Christmas tree on it, but your new damper does as well, so you can just rip that out, and then when you remove the damper, this will all come with it. Okay, now we're going to remove the top of the A-arm. So this takes a 15 millimeter socket, and behind the bolts there are 2 washers each. So when you remove the bolts, the washers will either drop out or get stuck. Just pull them out. Make sure you keep those for installation later. So now that we have the bolts loosened here for the A-arm, we'll actually need 2 people for this next section, so we're not going to be able to record it. But you would undo these 2 bolts all the way, pull them all the way out, remove the last couple bolts on the A-arm. The the whole hub will then be free and rotate a little bit. That'll allow this part to come out, and then you can slide the damper. It'll actually, the top, you'll be able to clear the top here. It'll come out this way, and you'll be able to pull the damper out over the top. Then all you have to do is take your new damper, insert it the same way you took that one out, and then make sure that you line up the bolts correctly and start reassembling it. So we have the new damper in, and we're still connecting the control arm. So what I wanted to show you is that the washers that were on the back of the control arm bolts have a little rubber in the center of them. That allows you to put the bolt in and put the washers on the back side, and they'll stay in. So it aids you when you're trying to line up the threads or the bolts to make sure you don't cross thread, that you can you don't have to support the bolts, they won't fall out. So if you can just slide that on the back and lift this up, and then you're going to need to jack up the hub slightly to get it to align. So you can see in here we got the A-arm back in. So these rubber pucks, they must be spring loaded. When you undo them, they turn like this. So what you need to do is when you're putting them back in, they put too much pressure on the bolts. So you have to, you're putting in one bolt, and the other one you use like a screwdriver or even an extension, and turn the arm here so that it's perpendicular or parallel with the frame. Then you're able to get your bolts just started, just thread them, and once you get all four of them in, you can just use your impact to go all the way in. So the damper's in, A-arm's in. We need to connect the electrical connection, and then we'll torque everything down. So here's the top of the damper, the electrical connection coming out, and you can see down there is the other side. So same thing as before. We need to lubricate the inside of the boot just a little bit, just so that the seal will let it go in into the two halves. Then the other thing is we need to push out the Christmas tree is still stuck in the frame down here, so we need to take our small screwdriver again, push it in. So there you've got the Christmas tree taken care of. You can see both sides of the connector here. So then you slide the two together. A little tricky here. On the other side you don't have the alternator, so it's not quite as tight as on this side. There, those click together, and then you reset the gray tab just by pushing it forward. There you go. It's locked into place. And then you just have to press the Christmas tree back into the frame. So now we're ready to torque all the bolts. So we're going to start with the top two on the damper. Just like the rear, it's 74 foot-pounds. So now we'll torque the bolts for the upper A-arm. These are 48 foot-pounds for the torque. So now that we've torqued the top of the damper and the upper A-arm, We still have to torque the lower part of the damper. The torque there for the 13 millimeter bolts are 24 foot-pounds. That completes the installation for both the front and rear damper. All you have to do then is put the wheels on, torque those down as well, and lower the car. You're all done.